An old woman received a visit from her daughter after decades. The daughter, pregnant, told her something about the baby's father that her mother never expected to hear. Eleanor, 70 years old, lived in a humble house that had seen better days. Every morning she rose before dawn to water a nearly forgotten garden, whose plants survived by some miracle amid weeds and parched soil. The dripping of the old hose broke a silence that grew heavier as the sun lit up the dusty corners of the property. In the afternoons, she would sit in the chair closest to the window, watching the wind scatter leaves and pieces of paper across the desolate yard. In that same chair, she reviewed letters she never dared to send, all addressed to someone who no longer belonged to her present. That exercise of reading and rereading reminders of her past seemed to be her only pastime. The echo of solitude was palpable in the air and in the cracks of the walls. Time, with a silent cruelty, had turned the home into a somber space, lacking laughter and youthful voices. The framed photographs on the sideboard reflected the story of a family that was once united, although those smiles were now a distant memory that persisted only in Elena's mind. It had been years since she last received visitors, so any unexpected noise beyond her daily routine startled her slightly. However, that morning's jolt was real and profound. The sound of footsteps approaching the front door broke the monotony. Intrigued, Eleanor wiped her damp hands on an old rag and went to the entrance. Upon opening the door, she found a nearly unrecognizable figure, carrying a bag and with a face marked by fatigue. It was Jenna, her 35-year-old daughter, whom she had not seen for decades. At first glance, it was impossible to ignore the swollen belly indicating her advanced pregnancy. Though Eleanor stood there slack-jawed, no sign of tenderness crossed her features. She seemed torn between the urge to embrace her daughter and the bitter temptation to reproach her for such a prolonged absence. Jenna looked equally uncomfortable. She clung to the door handle with a trembling hand, and after a brief greeting, stepped into the house that once was her home. Their initial exchange was filled with short phrases and evasive glances. When Elena asked how life had treated her during those long years and why she was returning now, Jenna looked away. The tension was palpable. Both realized how wide the gap was between them, not only in the time spent apart, but in the experiences they had never shared. Before long, Eleanor dared to ask about the baby's father, a delicate topic Jenna dodged with mumbling and uneasy silences. Although the old woman was eager for answers, she sensed her daughter was not prepared to reveal the truth just then. A strange weariness showed on the young woman's face, mixed with a hint of anxiety that stirred certain suspicions. Jenna seemed to be hiding something she could not bring herself to confess, and even mentioning it caused her visible tension. Eleanor, with her stoic nature, swallowed her questions. Both women's discomfort became increasingly evident, like a wall neither was willing to cross. Even so, a subtle worry surfaced in the old woman's expression. Without speaking a word of affection, she headed to the hallway, turned on an old bulb, and indicated a dimly lit room. She explained that her daughter could stay there as long as she needed. Despite the frigid atmosphere, Jenna felt a hint of relief at not being turned away immediately. She picked up her bag and walked into the room, unable to look her mother in the eye. Once Jenna closed the door behind her, silence descended again with renewed force. Elena stood still in the living room, staring at the threshold of that room. A few seconds passed, each one feeling endless. There was nothing harmonious about this reunion, yet something inside told her that her daughter's return foreshadowed new conflicts, possibly even explanations she had never demanded in the past. She sighed, attempting to quell a guilt that had been haunting her for some time. She knew those overdue conversations could not be postponed forever, but she also had no words of comfort for her pregnant daughter. Thus ended the first day of Jenna's sudden presence in the old house. Every corner seemed filled with unresolved memories, and although the future was uncertain, the seed of a revelation had already been planted. The room Elena had offered became a temporary refuge for a daughter burdened by secrets, while the mother went back to her seat by the window, her heart heavy and her mind full of unanswered questions. The silence they now shared confirmed there were still many open wounds that time had not managed to heal. Eleanor could not sleep at all that night. After the tense reunion with Jenna, she lay on her bed, hoping the early hours would soothe her mind full of questions. Yet the oppressive stillness of the house became more intense than ever. Around midnight, she finally got up with a weary sigh and walked over to a small storage room. Carefully pushing open the door so as not to make a sound, she switched on a flickering bulb that took several tries to light up the clutter. In one corner, covered by a dusty blanket, lay the old trunk that had remained sealed for years. Her hands trembling, she removed the blanket and lifted the squeaky lid. Inside was a jumble of photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, all connected to the Open Hearts orphanage. Among these images were the faces of children and teenagers who had passed through the institution. Elena set aside some photos until she found a particular one. It showed a young man named Ivan, his gaze serious, wearing an expression that combined rebellion and vulnerability. That face brought back memories that pained her to confront. She continued rummaging through the trunk until she found a press clipping with a bold headline, "Young man expelled for theft." The text, accompanied by a blurry photo, described a scandal that had caused quite a stir in the community at the time. Elena felt a lump in her throat. That article, kept so guardedly, was a silent witness to secrets she had never dared share with anyone, not even her own daughter. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing unease. She knew Jenna's visit carried the risk that all of it might come to light. While Elena was immersed in her memories, Jenna stirred awake on the other side of the house. Her forehead was covered in cold sweat, and she felt intense dizziness that forced her to steady herself against the wall. With difficulty, she stood up and noticed her body trembling lightly yet persistently. Her pregnancy had been complicated for months, and the strain of the journey, coupled with the stress of reuniting with her mother, only made it worse. Leaning over a bucket, she threw up what little she had eaten, trying to keep quiet so as not to alert Elena. However, her weakened state was evident in each gasp for air. By dawn, after a restless night, Elena emerged from her bedroom looking exhausted. She knew her daughter, despite the years apart, and immediately noticed the fatigue in Jenna's expression. Nevertheless, no hint of tenderness crossed her face, nor did she speak words of open concern. Instead, she merely offered her a cup of hot tea as both avoided making eye contact during their makeshift breakfast. Then, someone gently knocked on the door. It was Rick, a 50-year-old man who occasionally helped Elena with errands and groceries. He brought a bag of fresh food, and after a cordial greeting, turned his attention to the new occupant. Noticing Jenna's condition, he asked Elena if they had consulted a doctor, explaining there were free checkups in the village on certain days. The look of concern in Rick's eyes was unmistakable, yet Elena responded with an apparent coldness and distance. Even so, it was hard to ignore the small detail he carried, a wildflower he had picked along the way, which he offered shyly. Elena, both uncomfortable and grateful, took the flower without smiling. Her stern face reflected the tension she felt inside. Rick persisted, insisting Jenna needed a prompt checkup because, from the look of things, the pregnancy was not going smoothly. It was then that Eleanor, rattled by the mere mention of doctors and tests, revealed her true unease. She bit her lip before muttering in a low voice, "I don't want to stir up the past." That offhand comment had the impact of a door slamming shut. Rick fell silent and nodded, realizing he had stumbled onto a sensitive subject. Despite his good intentions, his presence did not seem enough to dispel Elena's fears. Meanwhile, Jenna kept her pain and confusion to herself, hurt by her mother's coldness, yet saying nothing. The atmosphere filled with an inescapable foreboding. Her pregnant daughter's arrival was only the first sign that the past, with all its secrets and guilt, might return in full force. And from Elena's reaction, it was clear it would do so soon. The morning sun cast a faint light in the kitchen, where Jenna was preparing an herbal tea to ease her persistent nausea. She moved slowly, feeling more fragile than usual. Silence continued to envelope the house with a density that stifled any attempt at conversation. Even so, the sound of Elena's footsteps in the hallway signaled that yesterday's tension had not faded. When the old woman appeared in the kitchen doorway, her gaze fixed on her daughter without disguise. Jenna looked up briefly, but said nothing. She set the steaming cup on the counter and sat down on a worn wooden chair. For a few seconds, they both just watched the rising steam, as though the tea were the only witness to their mutual discomfort. Finally, Elena broke the silence in her usual raspy, direct voice. "Have you thought about what I told you last night?" she asked, making it clear she was aware of how serious the pregnancy was, but revealing no sign of compassion. Jenna took a sip before replying. Her heart pounded at the thought of where this conversation might lead. "I'm fine. I can handle this by myself," she replied, avoiding mention of the medical checkup Rick had suggested. Elena was not satisfied. She folded her arms and looked at her with a blend of nervousness and impatience. Too many hours had passed without drawing a clear answer from Jenna about the baby's father. That question stuck in her mind like a stubborn thorn. "Don't lie to me. I want the truth," she demanded, stepping closer. "Who got you in this condition?" The young woman tried to dodge the question, but her mother's tone cornered her. With a trembling hand, Jenna set the teacup on the table and stood up, visibly distressed. "Fine, I'll tell you. But promise me you won't get more upset than necessary," she murmured, trying to keep her composure. Elena did not reply. Her stare demanded everything. Explanations, justifications, details. "The father is Ivan," Jenna confessed in a shaky voice. "He's 36 and he was at the Open Hearts Orphanage under your care." The silence that followed spoke louder than any shout. Elena took a few seconds to process the name she had struggled so long to bury in her memory. Immediately, her features hardened, reflecting a mix of horror and anger. "Ivan!" she exclaimed, almost disbelieving. "You can't be serious. That boy, he—" She could not continue speaking naturally. The memory of that troubled young man, expelled amid scandal, flooded her thoughts, rekindling guilt and resentment. Jenna took a step back, sensing her mother was on the verge of losing her temper. "He's not what you think," the daughter said, voice trembling. "I met him in the city. I had no idea he was once at your orphanage. It was just a coincidence. By the time we realized it, it was too late." Elena let out a cry of repressed rage, striking the table with her fist. "You don't know what you're talking about. Ivan was nothing but trouble. He was a thief, or worse," she roared, recalling the rumors that always circulated about him. Jenna, both physically and emotionally drained, put a hand to her chest in an attempt to calm her racing heart. "And where were you when I left this house?" she shot back, returning the accusation. "You never had time to look for me, let alone warn me about anything." Those words wounded Elena like a precise dart. The tension rose, becoming unbearable. The old woman's face twisted in pain and anger, while Jenna breathed heavily, feeling the air slip away. Suddenly, the young woman bent forward and placed a hand on her belly, her expression filled with alarm. "Jenna, are you all right?" asked Elena, for the first time displaying a glimpse of genuine alarm. But Jenna, caught in her desperation and a growing heart rate, couldn't give a clear response. She simply turned away and left the kitchen, heading toward her room, eager to escape her mother's judgmental stare. Her steps were clumsy, and in her haste, she nearly stumbled against the table. Stunned, Elena remained motionless, witnessing the scene without knowing exactly how to react. When Jenna locked herself in the room, silence fell upon the house once again, a hush now laden with urgency and unanswered questions. Elena stood rooted in the center of the living room, her hand still trembling from the nerves brought on by the altercation. There was no doubt that Ivan had been a pivotal figure in her life, someone the old woman would have preferred never to mention again. Reuniting with her daughter was reopening wounds she had never believed necessary to heal, and the very idea of reliving the past made her feel dizzy, though not in her body, but in her soul. Even so, there was no turning back. The most feared secret had come to light, and nothing would ever be the same within those 4 shadow-filled walls. Elena spent a near sleepless night trying to silence the memories that fought their way to the surface following Jenna's painful confession. The next morning, while washing the dishes in a mechanical fashion, her mind drifted into flashes of the past. Almost unwittingly, she conjured up images of that orphanage called Open Hearts, where she had once worked as the person in charge, and where Ivan, a rebellious teenager, had entered her life. In these retrospective visions, she saw herself younger, with the energetic look of someone who believes they can change the world. She recalled Ivan standing up for the younger children at the orphanage whenever older residents picked on them. She remembered the young man's boldness and courage, as well as the anger in his eyes whenever someone hurt his friends. His rebellious streak, which sometimes led to trouble, was also fueled by a caring heart, something Eleanor quietly admired. However, the scene that unsettled her most was signing that official document that resulted in Ivan's expulsion for alleged theft. In her mind's eye, she saw herself leaning over a desk, her hand shaking as the ink bled across the page, effectively barring him from the orphanage. Even now, she felt a pang recalling the disbelief on Ivan's face and how that decision tore apart any bond of closeness or respect that had once existed between them. Her thoughts abruptly vanished when she heard someone knocking at the door. Upon answering, she found a tall, kind-faced man in his 40s, Hector, the town doctor, who had received word from Rick about Jenna's worrisome condition. Without preamble, the doctor headed straight to the room where Eleanor's daughter was resting. Jenna, pale and breathing irregularly, allowed Hector to examine her. His diagnosis was unequivocal: high-risk pregnancy. Hector insisted she should avoid emotional shocks, excessive stress, and anything that might affect her heartbeat. "Does she have emotional support at home?" Hector asked, looking intently at Elena. Elena swallowed hard and replied evasively, a response that convinced no one. She was too shaken by the news that Ivan was the baby's father and by the weight of her own guilt. She gave a stiff nod, feeling the doctor's question cut through her as sharply as a reproach. Once Hector left, prescribing strict bed rest for Jenna and instructing them to keep a close eye on her, Rick appeared in the kitchen, looking worried. He had gone out to buy groceries and now took the opportunity to speak with Elena, noticing her distressed expression. "Elena, are you all right?" he asked gently. "I've heard rumors in town. They say Ivan, that boy who was expelled from the orphanage, has been wandering around. I don't know if it's true or just talk." Hearing Ivan's name from Rick's lips startled Elena. Her tense face betrayed her discomfort as she turned aside, pretending to be busy putting away the groceries. "Why stir up the past?" she muttered, trying to dodge the subject, feeling her pulse quicken. Rick interpreted her reaction as confirmation that Ivan's involvement with Elena must have been something serious. He knew that many in town had their own version of the young man's expulsion, and that rumors of misconduct and delinquency had sullied the orphanage's reputation and that of those who managed it. Elena's discomfort was obvious. She bit her lip, realizing that the recent past could no longer be kept hidden. Jenna was there, pregnant with Ivan's child, and the history she had tried so hard to bury threatened to come out into the open. After Rick left, Elena leaned against the wall, feeling like the air was in short supply. She could blame coincidence or fate, but the truth was that the ghosts of Open Hearts were more alive than ever, and a reckoning with the guilt she had never dared to face was looming. All morning, Eleanor busied herself tidying up the living room for what felt like the 100th time, shoving around the sparse furniture more forcefully than necessary. She was trying to escape the whirlwind of thoughts that had haunted her since Jenna's arrival, but she found it impossible to focus on household chores. That was when the house phone, An old, dusty device began to ring persistently. Eleanor's startled reaction was evident. It had been ages since that line had gotten any calls. Upon picking up, she heard the friendly voice of Sophia, the current director of the Open Hearts Orphanage, greeting her warmly. Sophia, a serene-tempered woman in her 40s, explained that she was organizing a reunion of former residents to commemorate the institution's anniversary and to raise funds for the children still living there. She added that Eleanor, who had once overseen operations, would be a valuable addition to the event, sharing her experiences. Elena's response was terse and defensive. "I'm sorry, but I don't think it's a good idea for me to show up," she said, narrowing her eyes as if Sophia could see her through the receiver. "Please, Eleanor," Sophia insisted. "Your presence would inspire others. It's also a wonderful chance to close old chapters and make peace with the past." "I have nothing to make peace with," Elena said curtly. And before Sophia could add anything more, she hung up with a gesture of exasperation. The silence that followed that call was so tense, it felt like a veil draping over the house. Sophia, on the other end, had clearly sensed an unresolved hostility or resentment. That forceful refusal left her with the impression that something important remained unsettled in Elena's conscience. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Sophia was sharing news of the anniversary with some of the former residents who had already received their invitations. Among them was Olivia, a 30-year-old woman who was quick to express her interest in attending. She had been close friends with Ivan during their teenage years, harboring both fond and painful memories of that time. In her mind, Ivan symbolized a rebellious spirit with a purpose, someone brave enough to stand up to those who bullied the weaker kids. Still, she also harbored guilt for not having spoken out sooner about certain injustices she had witnessed. "Do you think Ivan will come?" Olivia asked, biting her lip thoughtfully. Sophia shrugged. "I don't know, but our goal is to bring together everyone who was once part of Open Hearts. I don't want the wrongs of that era to remain buried without a chance at reconciliation." Resolute, Olivia announced that she would return to town to attend the commemoration, even if it meant reawakening strong emotions and reopening a deep wound in her heart. She still remembered the rumors surrounding Ivan's expulsion and how the innocence of many had been shattered then. If he decided to attend, maybe she would finally have a chance to clarify what really happened. Back at Elena's house, the atmosphere was weighted by a latent tension. Jenna, who noticed her mother growing more agitated by the day, decided to seize a moment when Elena stepped out to the patio. She began rummaging through old drawers and cabinets, hoping to find answers for her mother's behavior and for the intense reactions whenever Ivan's name was mentioned. In a corner of the living room closet, she came across a bundle of unsent letters and some loose papers. Leafing through one of them, she was astonished to see direct references to Ivan, mentioning his origins and details about his stay at the orphanage. Those documents had handwritten notes by Elena, indicating a close interest in Ivan, far more than Jenna could have imagined. They described the incidents in which the young man had been involved, but also included brief praises for his protective spirit toward the smaller children. Jenna's heart beat rapidly. Her mother knew Ivan well, and yet had never spoken to her about him. When Elena returned from the patio, she found her daughter holding the papers. The old woman froze in her tracks, her face twisted in a mixture of surprise and anger. Jenna, sensing the tension in the air, did not confront her directly. She merely put the bundle of letters away as carefully as she had found them. Even so, the seed of curiosity had already taken root. "What really happened with Ivan? Mom never told me the truth," Jenna murmured, loud enough for Elena to hear, yet without looking her in the eye. That comment reverberated through the room like an echo that could not be ignored. The daughter had discovered a shroud of mystery surrounding Elena and Ivan's relationship, and as the mother looked upon the evidence in Jenna's hands, she understood that her secrets were on the brink of being exposed. The question hung in the air, ushering in a new phase of a family story neither woman was prepared to confront. The next day, a bus screeched to a halt at the small town station, kicking up a cloud of dust along the dirt road. Ivan stepped off with a bag slung over his shoulder and a wistful look that revealed how much time had passed since his last visit. As he walked through the main streets, he caught sight of the old bakery, the church with its peeling walls, and the grey-fronted houses that had seen him grow up. This place, despite the years, seemed caught in a near unchanged slumber, as if time had stopped for everything but the inhabitants' memories. As he walked, Ivan couldn't help a slight shudder at the thought of how his return would be received. He recalled the rumors and the faces of those who had judged him when, in his adolescence, he had been accused of theft at Open Hearts. But this time, his objective was clear. He wanted to see Jenna, the woman he loved, whose presence had motivated him to face his ghosts. He also came with a steadfast intent to clear his name, determined to shake off the stigma that had clung to him since the day of his expulsion. With steady steps, he headed toward Elena's house. After walking a few blocks, he finally spotted the old gate and the cracked walls that meant he had arrived. The doorbell didn't work, so he knocked and waited. At last, Elena answered with a deep frown. At the sight of him, her eyes went wide with a mix of surprise and fear. A sharp silence settled over them both before she managed to whisper, You've come back." Ivan took a step forward, speaking with calm determination. "I've come to see Jenna," he stated plainly. "I know she's here, and I also want to set things straight about what happened years ago. I'm tired of carrying a blame I don't deserve." Elena clenched her jaw and looked away, clearly uncomfortable. She stood stiffly, trying to keep her composure, but it was obvious the painful memories left her uneasy. "Don't you dare dredge up what I already considered buried," she whispered. "But if you've come for my daughter, I won't stop you, as long as you don't upset her. Her pregnancy is delicate." Ivan's heart pounded as he confirmed how vulnerable Jenna was. Yet before he could say anything else, Jenna herself appeared in the hallway, visibly agitated. Her eyes shone when she recognized Ivan's voice, yet the tension between him and her mother filled the air. "What's going on?" she asked, instinctively placing a hand on her belly. Elena took a step back, allowing Ivan and Jenna to face each other. The young woman, though clearly exhausted, offered a hesitant smile. However, the moment of tenderness was cut short by a lingering hostility. Summoning his courage, Ivan stated his position. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said to Elena, "but I won't go on bearing these unfair accusations. I have a right to defend myself." "I don't want to hear any more of your excuses," Elena muttered, trying in vain to hide the anger that still boiled within her. At that moment, Jenna felt a pang in her chest, and a sudden bout of dizziness forced her to steady herself against the wall. Ivan rushed forward to support her, while Elena looked on, paralyzed. Jenna's face had gone pale, and her lips were trembling. Alarmed, Ivan called her name. That was when Hector, the doctor, appeared at the door, having been alerted by Rick of Ivan's imminent arrival and the mounting tension. Hector leaned over Jenna, quickly checking her pulse. "We need to move her somewhere quiet," he warned. "I told you, Elena, any strong emotion can jeopardize the pregnancy." With Ivan's help, Hector carried Jenna to her room. She was still breathing unevenly, but they managed to settle her down and calm her a bit. After examining her, the doctor confirmed that the baby was still stable, though the mother required immediate bed rest. The situation had reached a critical point, and the tension in the house felt like a minefield. Once everything seemed under control, Ivan took Jenna's hand gently. She gazed at him through unshed tears, while he lowered his head and murmured words of encouragement. "I'm here with you. I'm not going anywhere," he promised, struggling to keep his own anxiety at bay. Standing by the door, Elena watched with a guilt-ridden expression. The old wound had reopened before her eyes, and now that Ivan was by her daughter's side, she realized that time had not healed that dark past. It had merely turned it into a ticking time bomb. Their family drama intensified. On one side, two people in love, reuniting. On the other, the grim memories threatening to shatter the fragile balance that allowed them to move forward. That silence, laden with blame and regret, became the soundtrack of a moment that would forever alter all their fates. The echo of recent voices and arguments had overwhelmed Ivan. After Jenna's collapse, his priority was to make sure she rested, so he spent the early morning hours by her bedroom door. However, once he saw her more stable, he decided to step out for some fresh air. He wandered through dusty streets with his hands in his pockets, no clear destination in mind. A need to regain his composure drove him so he could once again face Elena and all the memories that had been stirred up in recent days. On his walk, he noticed a small establishment he couldn't recall seeing before. A cafe with tables set out on the sidewalk and a hand-painted sign reading, "Olivia's Cafe." Curious, he went inside to order something that might clear his head. Immediately, the aroma of freshly ground coffee and baked bread carried him back to simpler times, far from strife and guilt. Behind the counter stood Olivia, busy with a battered old coffee maker. When she looked up, her eyes went wide in surprise upon recognizing Ivan, and a nostalgic smile lit up her face. They greeted each other with a warm hug, instantly reminded of the bond they'd shared in adolescence, back when they both lived at open hearts. For Olivia, their reunion was more than a polite gesture. It was the return of a friend she cherished and had never truly forgotten. "Ivan!" she exclaimed excitedly. "It's been so long! How have you been?" He sighed, unsure where to begin. "I came back to town for some important matters," he explained, trying not to reveal too much. He merely mentioned that Jenna, his fiancée and the mother of his unborn child, was in delicate health at Elena's house. Olivia, withholding judgment, invited him to a secluded table so they could talk in private. She offered him a latte and some freshly baked rolls. Their initial conversation centered on memories of their time at the orphanage and how each had rebuilt their life afterward. Olivia mentioned that Sophia, the current director, had announced a plan to gather all former residents for the upcoming anniversary. "She wants us to share our stories," Olivia said, taking a sip of her coffee. "But she also wants the injustices that many of us went through, ignored by everyone back then, to finally come to light." Olivia's words had a liberating effect on Ivan. It reassured him he was not alone in seeking redemption. At the same time, he realized it forced him to stir up a past that, one way or another, was now coming back in full force. Meanwhile, over at the orphanage, Sophia was spending her afternoons rummaging through dusty drawers and forgotten shelves, gathering photos and historical documents for the upcoming celebration. That was how she came across a set of financial records that stunned her. Suspicious accounting reports and odd signatures hinted at possible embezzlement in the management of the orphanage years ago. The word misappropriation appeared in several notes, and when Sophia compared them with the files on Ivan's expulsion, it all fit together like a grim puzzle. "Ivan was accused of stealing to cover up something bigger," Sophia said to herself, her stomach knotting. That discovery suggested the real culprit, or culprits, had used Ivan's reputation to shift the focus and protect their own shady interests. Over at Elena's house, the atmosphere remained heavy. Jenna had recovered slightly, though she was still weak. When Ivan returned, he tried to speak with Elena in the kitchen. She tensed her jaw and avoided his gaze. Every attempt of his to engage her in conversation ran into a wall of coldness and shame. It was obvious Elena couldn't forgive herself for what had happened in the past, let alone face the truth in front of the person who had been unfairly expelled. Jenna, watching anxiously from the hallway, sensed that something very serious separated her mother and Ivan, even if she didn't know the precise details. She approached Ivan, took his hand, and pleaded in a shaky voice, "Please be patient. My mom's not well. I know she carries her own burden. She just doesn't know how to tell you." Ivan exhaled, swallowing his frustration. Seeing Jenna so fragile, he could only nod, aware that she needed calm and unconditional support. Yet he couldn't ignore the stinging sense of injustice still pulsing in his memory. That night, as Ivan was about to turn in, he saw a missed call from an unknown number on his phone. Checking his voicemail, he found a message from Sophia. Her voice was steady but pressed with urgency. "Hi, Ivan. Sorry to bother you so late, but I found something that could prove your innocence. I need you to come to the orphanage as soon as you can." The message ended abruptly, filling the air with a suspense that sent a chill down Ivan's spine. He felt a rush of hope mixed with the pent-up anger over the years he had lived with a blame he didn't deserve. This news, hinting at a chance to clear his name, also foretold confrontations that would inevitably unearth every shard of his past with Elena and the orphanage that once connected them. Morning brought a mild haze over the town, and with it came plenty of chatter in the general store, the gathering spot for locals eager to exchange any bit of news. People had been congregating there since early hours to buy provisions and, of course, to gossip. In recent days, the main topic was Ivan's sudden appearance in town. Some recalled a kind-hearted boy who, despite his rebellious streak, never hesitated to stand up for the weaker kids. Others, however, still labeled him a convicted thief whose return could only bring trouble. "I saw him grow up in that orphanage," said one woman, juggling a sack of flour. "He never struck me as a bad person." "Well, I'm not so sure," countered another with a wary tone. "Didn't they expel him for robbery? If he did it once, he might do it again." The remarks kept coming, creating a polarized atmosphere. Everyone held firm opinions, uninterested in listening to the other side. A sense of uncertainty stoked the embers of bitterness, and Ivan's name became the talk of the town. No one had the faintest idea how many secrets were boiling beneath the surface of his story. Over at Open Hearts, Sophia tried to keep her investigation low-key, but word spread quickly, soon reaching the ears of Leonard, a 55-year-old man on the current board of directors. Upon learning that Sophia was inspecting old records and contacting former orphans, he frowned, visibly displeased. "We can't allow old matters to be reopened," Leonard told a colleague. "If a scandal erupts, donations will dry up, and the orphanage could be forced to close." It was a veiled but forceful threat. From the day the orphanage opened, private contributions had been essential to keep it running, and a reputation-damaging scandal might be fatal. Leonard cast a stern look at the rest of the board, making it plain he would do whatever it took to stop Sophia if necessary. Meanwhile, in Elena's modest home, tensions grew with each passing day. Jenna was on bed rest, trying to keep her emotions in check for the baby's sake. Ivan, for his part, paced around the house or went out for walks, restless yet reluctant to pressure Elena into a conversation. That afternoon, Rick arrived with bags of groceries and insisted on speaking with the old woman, concerned by her troubled face. "You seem very distressed, Elena," he said gently, inviting her to sit on an old chair in the yard. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Elena's eyes were red, and at first she resisted. Yet the emotional weight was too heavy. "I had no choice," she whispered, staring at the ground. "All I could think of was my family. If I didn't do it, everything would have been worse." Rick waited in silence, not pushing her. That small confession told him enough. Eleanor's guilt was tied to decisions made long ago, choices that clearly harmed Ivan. He refrained from probing further, seeing how tormented she was. "Sometimes," Elena went on, "I wish I could turn back time and do things differently." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. After a while, Rick said goodbye respectfully, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. He didn't want to press or upset her, but he understood that something very serious lay behind Ivan's story and the orphanage. Once he left, Elena returned inside, unable to hold back her tears. She went to a dusty piece of furniture, opened a drawer, and took out an old photograph. The image showed Ivan as just a child, wearing a faint, gentle smile. She stared at it for several seconds, her tears continuing to fall. That single picture spoke for itself. Deep down, she had genuinely cared for the boy, despite the drastic measures she had taken against him. A torrent of emotions coursed through her, fueled by the realization that the consequences of her past actions now stood before her, demanding a truth she could no longer postpone. There, alone in the dimness of the living room, she cried not only for Ivan, but for everything she never dared to put right. The day began under a light mist shrouding the town, yet Ivan soon made his way to Open Hearts, where he had arranged to meet Sofia about the documents that could prove his innocence. Crossing the old gate, he felt a knot in his stomach. Returning to the place that held so many memories was both an act of courage and a source of pain. Sofia greeted him in her small office, which lay in disarray from her frantic search through old records. Stacks of ledgers and bank statements were strewn across her desk. "Thank you for coming," said the director gravely. "I found suspicious bank records from almost 20 years ago. They mention an administrator, Alexander, who disappeared after embezzling funds." The word embezzlement was underlined on several documents, and as Ivan leafed through them, he noticed his own name next to references to disciplinary incidents and minor thefts that coincided, suspiciously, with the official charge of robbery against him. Pointing to a series of questionable accounting entries, Sofia explained that someone had needed a scapegoat to cover up missing funds, and that scapegoat had been Ivan. "I can't believe this," he muttered, eyes fixed on the numbers. "My rebelliousness was always a problem for some people, but I never imagined they would use me to cover up a crime." A profound sense of relief mixed with anger took hold of him. For years, he had borne the label of criminal, forced to live under the mistrust and rejection of so many. Now, seeing evidence that he was intentionally set up, drove him to demand justice. Sofia sensed the inner storm raging in Ivan and, in a gesture of solidarity, rested a hand on his shoulder. "I need your permission to present these findings at the upcoming meeting," she explained. "I know it won't be easy, but it's time for what they did to you to finally be brought to light." Meanwhile, Olivia had embarked on her own mission, gathering other former residents of the orphanage, using whatever contacts or scraps of information she had. She went around town and sent messages, explaining the plan to commemorate the anniversary and offering them an opportunity to share their stories. In an improvised cafe, she listened to accounts that reopened still festering wounds, verbal abuse, negligence, disproportionate punishments. Many recalled how Ivan, despite his reputation for being troublesome, always stood up to those who preyed on the weakest. That earned him enemies, but also the admiration of many who now felt compelled to support him. "We're not defenseless kids anymore," Olivia told a small group of ex-residents. "If there's going to be a public event, we should seize the chance to tell the truth. No one else should have to go through what we did." Expectations continued to build. It became clear that the gathering would be far more than a simple anniversary celebration. It would be a collective catharsis where the long-silenced voices would finally speak, shaking the foundations of the orphanage, and perhaps the whole town. At Eleanor's house, tension rose just as quickly. Becoming increasingly aware of the grim past, Jenna demanded answers. From her bedroom, she summoned the courage to confront her mother. "Why do you hate Ivan so fiercely?" she asked, eyes filled with sadness. "You know he's the father of my child. I need to understand what happened." Elena closed her eyes, visibly distressed. Without divulging the full truth, she managed only to promise, "When everything settles down, I'll tell you. I don't want your health to deteriorate because of me." All the while, Ivan watched from the doorway, harboring a quiet resentment. The old bitterness burned in his chest, but Jenna was right. Her well-being and the babies were what mattered. He left the scene to avoid escalating the conflict, aware that his main goal was still to prove he had been framed. Around midnight, Sofia was sifting through notes and a list of phone calls when her cell phone vibrated. It was an anonymous message, brief but unsettling. "Stop this. You could ruin the orphanage." The director stared at the screen, her heart pounding, sensing the looming presence of those who didn't want old secrets unearthed. Someone, maybe Leonard or some other accomplice, was trying to silence her before the entire web of lies could be exposed. That text message foreshadowed turmoil, but Sophia refused to back down. Her priority was to bring justice to those who had suffered under a corrupt system. As night wore on, a dense hush cloaked the streets of the town, heralding the momentous changes about to unfold at Open Hearts. Sophia set off before dawn for a neighboring village, following a lead Rick had uncovered after much investigation. This place, even smaller and poorer than the one Open Hearts called home, lay at the end of a dirt road riddled with potholes. The reason for Sophia's journey was extremely delicate: finding Alexander, the former administrator who decades earlier had been tied to the embezzlement scheme that led to Ivan's wrongful accusation of theft. After asking around, Sophia arrived at a run-down house, its roof on the verge of collapse, with a neglected garden out front. There she found Alexander, a 65-year-old man barely resembling who he once was. He appeared ill, worn down, coughing frequently, and moving with the aid of a cane. Upon hearing Sophia's name and learning she was from the orphanage, his first reaction was to shake his head, fearing for his own safety. "I know I made a serious mistake," he admitted in a low voice, glancing at the closed door as though expecting unwanted visitors. "But I don't have long to live, and I don't want trouble with the powerful people who are still behind all this." Sophia sensed that, despite everything, Alexander longed to unburden his conscience. She invited him to sit and spoke gently. She explained that she had evidence Ivan was wrongly accused of theft in order to hide financial misdeeds committed by more influential figures. Alexander nodded, confirming that he had taken part in the cover-up and that over the years his guilt had become unbearable. However, his fear lingered. His eyes betrayed the distrust of a man who believed he was still being pursued. While Sophia looked for a way to convince him to testify, Jenna back in town was dealing with her own mix of frustration and sadness. Forced to remain on strict bed rest due to repeated early labor threats, she felt powerless, unable to join Ivan in the investigation he so desperately needed. Hector visited her regularly to check her condition and offer reassurance. "You must keep away from any shocks," the doctor gently reminded her. "The slightest spike in stress could bring on serious complications for you and the baby." Jenna, subdued by her circumstances, nodded with resignation. She felt that while her health hung in the balance, Ivan was facing the shadows of the past alone. That was why, at night, when her anxiety became unbearable, she forced herself to imagine the moment when it would all be resolved. Ivan's innocence proven, and the family united with no secrets or regrets. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Sophia phoned Ivan to tell him what she had learned from Alexander. She told him that, after much urging, the former administrator had admitted to his role in the conspiracy, making it clear that Ivan had been an expendable pawn used to hide the crimes of more powerful individuals. Still, Alexander wouldn't make an official statement without security guarantees. He feared that the powerful people he had mentioned might retaliate. "We need him at the ex-residents' reunion," Sophia pointed out. "Your testimony alongside his would be the definitive proof to clear your name." On the other end of the line, Ivan felt a rush of hope mixed with a painful sense of outrage at all the years he had lived under the thief label. He took a moment to let it all sink in, breathing deeply before answering. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure Alexander feels safe. They can't keep hiding the truth." During this time, Leonard had caught wind that Sophia had left town and was contacting key figures from the past. Immediately, he began plotting ways to undermine Alexander's credibility. He knew that if this man talked, the names of several accomplices would be exposed. Donations and the orphanage's reputation would hang by a thread, and to him, it was better to silence Alexander than to let a scandal break out. By nightfall, Sophia again called Ivan to give him one final piece of news. "Alexander will speak at the reunion if we guarantee his security. He's sick and fears for his life, but he no longer wants to die with this secret on his conscience." That confession rang like a beacon of hope in Ivan's heart. With Alexander ready to testify, Ivan's innocence was no longer mere speculation. It could be definitively proven. Though many threats and pressures lay ahead, Ivan felt for the first time that he wasn't alone. Someone else was prepared to step forward and ensure the truth finally came to light. Elena hadn't slept a wink all night. After hearing that Alexander, the former administrator, might testify to Ivan's innocence, she realized that her past was about to catch up with her. This knowledge weighed heavily in her chest, and she drifted into a half-conscious state that inevitably brought her back to the hardest time in her life. In that flashback haunting her, she saw herself several years younger, sitting in a hospital corridor, holding her husband's hand, a man whose face was pallid, his body ravaged by illness. The diagnosis had been devastating, and the medical bills skyrocketed well beyond her meager budget. Back then, Eleanor worked at Open Hearts, and despite the low wage, that income was vital for paying her husband's treatments. She recalled vividly the face of one of her superiors. She wasn't entirely sure if it was Leonard or another board member, who put before her the document sentencing Ivan's expulsion, demanding her signature on the grounds of an alleged theft he had committed. Even then, she suspected the boy was innocent. She had seen him protect the more vulnerable children, take responsibility for mischief that, in reality, others had caused. But the pressure was suffocating. The orphanage prided itself on its excellent reputation and needed a scapegoat to conceal their financial discrepancies. "If you don't sign," warned that superior, "you'll lose your job. Have you thought about how you'll cover your husband's medical costs?" The image of her bedridden husband kept assaulting her whenever she hesitated. Finally, she chose to scrawl her shaky signature on the document, doing so through tears and with her heart crushed by guilt. It felt as though a chill ran down her spine, sealing the fate of that teenager who, in her eyes, was just a rebellious kid wounded by life. The memory of Ivan's disbelieving face as he was expelled had become a dagger lodged in her conscience ever since. She woke from that trance with her heart pounding and sweat beading on her forehead. It took her several minutes of deliberate breathing to calm down and process the fact that this time the truth might actually come out. Despite the years gone by, her actions still held her prisoner. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Leonard continued maneuvering to protect the board's interests. He summoned Sophia to an urgent meeting where he, brow furrowed, made his stance clear. "At the anniversary, no scandals," he declared gravely. "The orphanage's reputation is on the line. If you, Sophia, let those old stories surface, you'll put the donations that feed these children at risk." Sophia pressed her lips together. She despised the way they used the children as an excuse to cover up past crimes. She left the meeting with shaking hands, filled with anger, but more determined than ever. She would not suppress the truth or cave in to Leonard's veiled threats. At Elena's house, the air remained heavy. Rick arrived at dusk, sensing she might need a friendly ear. His hunch was right. Finding her eyes red from crying, he took a seat next to her and gently patted her hunched shoulders. "This is all too much," she said, on the verge of tears again. "I don't want to be publicly shamed, but I know it could all come out any day now." Rick realized there was something deeper involved than mere regret. Even without all the details, he intuited that Elena had played a pivotal role in Ivan's expulsion. "The truth always finds a way," he murmured gently. "Maybe it's time to face it instead of running from it." Elena nodded, head down, feeling as though her world might crumble at any moment. After Rick left, she remained alone in the dining room, gazing out the window as the night sky filled with clouds. In the dim light, she spotted Ivan and Jenna in the backyard, locked in an embrace as they weathered the fragility of their situation. The young woman rested her head on Ivan's shoulder, and he lightly stroked her belly, as though soothing both his own fears and hers. It was an image that tore open Elena's old wound. So much harm had been done in the name of survival. Seeing Jenna happy with Ivan, awaiting a baby who would be Elena's grandchild, only made the guilt echo louder in her mind. For the first time, she sensed she could no longer remain silent. A new resolve flickered in her eyes, someone on the verge of confessing what had tormented her for so many years. The moment to speak her truth was drawing near, no matter the cost. Dawn had barely broken when Rick and Olivia set off for the neighboring town, sharing a mutual determination. Rick offered to drive his old car, and Olivia didn't hesitate to accompany him, convinced that Alexander was the key to uncovering the entire truth about Ivan's innocence. The journey unfolded mostly in silence, broken only by brief comments on the situation awaiting them when they arrived. Where Sophia had found Alexander, he was sitting in the doorway, gripping a cane with trembling hands and eyeing the newcomers warily. His face, etched with premature wrinkles and sadness, spoke of the hardships of recent years. Upon recognizing Olivia, who greeted him kindly, and Rick, whose expression conveyed understanding, Alexander relaxed a bit. "I won't lie to you," he admitted in a raspy voice. "I don't want to go back to that town. I left behind too many fears and stories I'd rather forget." Rick, trying to reassure him, explained cautiously, "We've come to offer you protection and medical care. If your health gets worse, we can take you to the hospital. And if you decide to testify, we promise you won't be alone." Olivia's sincerity also proved decisive. She told him how important his testimony was to clear Ivan's name and prevent more injustices from taking place at the Open Hearts orphanage. Each word chipped away at Alexander's resistance, until at last he nervously intertwined his fingers and agreed. "All right, I'll do the right thing, but I'm afraid powerful people won't want me talking." Even knowing the risks, Rick and Olivia smiled gratefully. With a makeshift suitcase and his cane in hand, Alexander climbed into the car, closing a chapter of his life in that bleak place. He glanced out the window for one last look at the drab landscape, which for years had mirrored the guilt and fear that weighed on him. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Sophia and a group of volunteers worked tirelessly on preparations for the anniversary. They arranged chairs in the main courtyard, hung banners highlighting the history of Open Hearts, and sent invitations to various families, former residents, and local media. Once the press got involved, a ripple of excitement spread through town. Some were thrilled to have the chance to share their stories, while others fretted about the revelation of dark secrets they would rather keep buried. Leonard, upon learning that journalists would indeed be attending, grew alarmed. He realized that the appearance of witnesses like Alexander, or even former residents willing to speak, would bring both the orphanage's reputation and his own into question. In a flurry of urgent phone calls and meetings with powerful associates, he devised a plan to counteract the rumors, though nothing he did seemed enough to halt the winds of change. Ivan, for his part, spent most of his time at Elena's house, keeping a close watch on Jenna's health. One starry evening, the two sat together on a makeshift bench in the back patio. Jenna rested her head on Ivan's shoulder while he gently stroked her belly. "Sometimes I can't believe life has brought us here," Ivan whispered. "You've been my rock when no one else believed in me." Jenna, feeling his unwavering love, replied softly, "I trust that if we can finally heal this wound, our baby will be born free from all this tension. Whether here or somewhere else, we'll build the family we've always wanted." Ivan pulled her closer, vowing that nothing and no one would steal that dream from them. In his words, Jenna sensed the resolve of someone who had been unjustly branded for too long. To him, clearing his name was more than a personal act of justice. It was the chance to give his child a future untainted by the ghosts of his own childhood. The next morning, Rick and Olivia headed back with Alexander. Their car crawled along the road, as though burdened by the memories each of them carried. In the back seat, Alexander kept his eyes on the horizon, knowing that an inevitable showdown awaited him in town. He mulled over the consequences of revealing everything he knew: financial mismanagement, manipulations that pinned the blame on Ivan. Yet at the same time, he felt a strange calm, the possibility of finally redeeming himself and doing what was right. As the car neared the town entrance, The sun bathed the rusted rooftops and dusty streets in golden light. An expectant hush lingered in the air, as though this morning heralded the prelude to an unavoidable confrontation. Alexander's return looked poised to trigger a sweeping change, carrying with it the hope that the truth, long silenced, would at last find its voice. A rare bustle overtook the town at sunrise on the day set for the big meeting. From the early hours, former residents arrived from remote locations, some now settled in the city, others who hadn't set foot on those dusty streets in years. A palpable mix of nostalgia and caution filled the air. For many, coming back meant confronting painful memories left behind in the halls of open hearts. Their stories were as varied as their faces. Some came with grateful hearts, recalling the few staff members who truly helped them during their stay at the institution. Others arrived harboring raw resentment, certain that the system had failed them when they most needed protection. More than a few whispered they wanted concrete answers, not just another anniversary celebration that glossed over the abuses and injustices so many had endured. Sophia, the director, wandered through the orphanage, addressing last-minute logistical details. While overseeing the chairs in the main courtyard and fielding questions from local reporters, she could sense the growing tension among the ex-residents. Many were not there to share a pleasant reunion. They came eager to close old wounds, to demand explanations, and in some cases, to confront those responsible for their suffering. The charged atmosphere hinted that this event, far from being a peaceful commemoration, might unleash confessions and even confrontations. Meanwhile, at Elena's house, another kind of tension was unfolding. Restless over her high-risk pregnancy, Jenna repeatedly urged her mother to accompany her to the orphanage and support Ivan, who needed all the strength he could get. Elena, torn between guilt and fear, hesitated. In her heart, she knew that showing up meant exposing herself to both the ex-residents and the press, risking public blame for a past that grew heavier every day. Yet each time Jenna begged her to attend, Elena caught sight of Ivan in the background, his silence a wordless plea for basic decency. "You're the only one who can clear this up," Jenna said, gripping her mother's hand. "We need you there, Mom. Ivan won't say it, but he wants you to step forward." Elena bowed her head, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. Echoes of old choices clamored in her mind. That was when Rick, who had stepped in upon overhearing, spoke in his usual gentle way. "Maybe this is the only way to find the peace you've been looking for, Elena," he said softly. "Sometimes, speaking the truth brings far more relief than keeping it inside." Across town, Leonard, a member of the orphanage's board, was in private, flanked by a couple of stern-faced men. The night before, he had learned that Alexander, the former administrator in charge when Ivan was expelled, was returning to testify. Panic etched itself into Leonard's features. He knew how risky it would be for Alexander to reveal the financial irregularities that had profited several board members while destroying the reputation of an innocent young man. Immediately, Leonard hatched a plan to discredit the witness. He ordered his closest contacts to spread rumors that Alexander was senile and no longer had a clear grasp of the facts. He even considered sending a couple of thugs to intercept him on the road, to delay or sabotage his arrival in town. He could sense a storm closing in, and any misstep could thrust him into total disgrace. By mid-morning, people were gathered in the orphanage courtyard. Sophia moved from corner to corner, greeting ex-residents with a mixture of wariness and hope. It was clear that many in attendance were seeking more than a hollow celebration. They were looking for a platform to expose injustices and come to terms with the past. In hushed exchanges and wary glances, talk spread that Alexander was on his way to testify, intensifying the anxiety of those who feared losing everything if the truth emerged. In this flurry of arrivals, Elena was still nowhere to be seen. With every passing minute, Jenna wondered if her mother would have the courage to show up, and deep down, Ivan wondered the same. Rick stayed close to the young woman, offering reassurances and reminding her that perhaps Elena's decision to attend, or not, would define whether events might lead to reconciliation or an irrevocable breach. Meanwhile, on some dusty stretch of road, Alexander rode in a rickety car with Rick and Olivia, unaware of the sabotage Leonard had planned behind the scenes. Tension climbed ever higher as all the pieces converged on the place where truths, long kept silent, would finally be celebrated or contested. Late morning sunlight filtered through the branches in the main courtyard of Open Hearts. Beneath a makeshift awning stood several rows of chairs for returning ex-residents, townspeople, and local journalists. At the back, a small platform and projector stood ready for the anniversary ceremony, an event that promised to be much more than a mere celebration. Sophia took her place on stage, microphone in hand. Heart pounding, she surveyed the crowd gathered before her. She knew that beyond the commemoration itself lay a tangled web of lingering guilt, tension, and old wounds. Drawing a deep breath, she began, "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this anniversary of Open Hearts. It's an honor to see so many familiar faces, and of course, the local press who've come to cover this special occasion." A tentative round of applause rose into the air, although some ex-residents merely crossed their arms in silence. The mood was bittersweet. For some, returning to the orphanage inspired gratitude. For others, it was a jarring reminder of painful memories still festering. Sophia continued, switching on the projector. On the makeshift screen, images in black and white, alternating with more recent color photos, flickered into view. The crowd saw the old dormitories, the corridors where children and teenagers had laughed, cried, and grown up. Suddenly, faces appearing on screen were recognizable among the audience, childhood smiles now visible on adult faces, some already graying, their gazes hardened by time. As the slides rolled on, a stir arose at the back. Ivan and Jenna had entered hand in hand. She walked carefully, her notably pregnant belly emphasizing each step, her expression tense. Ivan, eyes focused straight ahead, stood firm, intent on clearing his name and finding answers. A murmur spread among the ex-residents. Some remembered him as the supposed thief expelled years before, while others seemed relieved that he was there to claim his due justice. Shortly after, almost unnoticed, Elena slipped into the courtyard. Her expression was drawn tight with anxiety, fingers interlaced, gaze downcast. Jenna, seeing her mother arrive, locked eyes with her in a silent plea, as if willing her to find the courage to face what lay ahead. Ivan, meanwhile, managed only a brief glance before turning back to the stage, where Sophia continued speaking. It's been many years since Open Hearts was founded with the hope of sheltering and educating kids who, for various reasons, lacked a stable home. Today, many former residents have become parents, professionals, ordinary citizens living their lives. We're grateful you've all returned to share this moment with us. With that introduction, Sophia moved on to a round of testimonies from the ex-residents. One after another, several men and women stood to share pieces of their stories. A young man named Ricardo recounted how Ivan defended him from bullying when he was just a child. A serious-eyed woman described Ivan's acts of rebellion, always causing trouble by standing up for the weaker kids. Amid light applause and fleeting glances, the audience began to see how many layers existed in the personal stories of those gathered. Emotions ran high, and the tension became thick. Not all the memories were pleasant. Some spoke of hardship, of unjust punishments, of enforced silences. Yet this collective catharsis seemed to herald a greater truth about to emerge. Sophia felt a lump in her throat, realizing how many voices had gone unheard for years and were only now daring to speak. When the initial round of testimonies ended, Sophia returned to the center of the stage. She glanced at Ivan, who looked back at her expectantly, and also noticed Elena, stiff-backed in one of the rear seats. Then, with her pulse racing, she spoke. "Thank you for your brave accounts. There's someone else who wants to address you today. Someone whose story is crucial to understanding what really happened at Open Hearts." Her voice trailed off upon seeing at the entrance Rick and another figure with a weary gait. Alexander, the former administrator, leaning on his cane, face drawn with anxiety. Many in the crowd turned toward the door, holding their breath. The sight of him cut the scene short, making it clear that a decisive new chapter was about to begin. Everyone braced themselves, knowing that whatever Alexander might say could change the course of this story forever. A buzz of murmurs spread through the courtyard of open hearts as Alexander, supported by his cane and walking with unsteady steps, made his way to the platform. Sophia offered him the microphone, aware that this man carried a burden he had concealed for far too many years. An expectant hush fell upon the crowd. Ex-residents, townspeople, and reporters alike held their breath, waiting for what he was about to reveal. "I'm sorry for how nervous I am," Alexander began in a wavering voice. "You might not recognize me, but I was an administrator here almost 2 decades ago. Today, I've come to tell the truth and to ask your forgiveness." His confession rumbled like thunder in the calm of the moment. With every word, the trembling in his hands became more pronounced, and tears brimmed in his eyes without quite spilling over. He explained that back then, he had misappropriated orphanage funds and that the situation worsened when another board member, now deceased, joined in the fraud, increasing the scale of the embezzlement. He admitted that to cover it up, they blamed Ivan for stealing money and valuables, taking advantage of his reputation as a rebellious kid. I did it to save myself," Alexander went on, lifting his gaze toward the crowd. "I fabricated evidence, signed falsified documents. I ruined the life of an innocent boy. My conscience hasn't let me sleep ever since." A flurry of reactions arose among those present. Several ex-residents looked at one another in disbelief, while reporters frantically jotted down notes or snapped photo after photo. Most were stunned and dismayed. So many had grown up believing the official account of Ivan as a thief, someone the orphanage had expelled to protect the other children. Leonard, perched at the edge of the stage, immediately sprang to his feet. Sweat dotted his forehead, and he leveled an accusing finger at Alexander. "He's lying!" he bellowed, voice raw and agitated. "That man is crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just a senile old fool. Don't listen to him." For a moment, silence settled over the courtyard once more. Alexander stood his ground, though his expression showed the emotional blow inflicted by such a vicious outburst. Sophia, retaining her composure, stepped forward and raised a folder containing several documents she had gathered in recent weeks. "I have here copies of records that Alexander signed at the time," Sophia explained, addressing the crowd gravely. "They bear the same signatures we've seen on official administrative files and on the papers documenting Ivan's expulsion. These documents confirm Alexander's responsibility, yes, but they also prove Ivan was framed." A ripple of shocked whispers and heightened tension coursed through the crowd. Faced with hard evidence, several journalists turned their cameras on Leonard, whose posture showed mounting unease. Forced to retreat, he locked his gaze on the ground, struggling for words that might back up his desperate attempt to discredit Alexander. All the while, standing at the back of the crowd, Elena listened with shaky breaths. For years, she'd tried to justify her silence, but now she could no longer deny her own passive involvement. She remembered signing that paper, aware, or at least suspecting, that Ivan was innocent. Alexander's confession only intensified her guilt. From a strategic vantage point, Ivan watched her with a tense jaw. There was no hatred in his eyes, just a profound weariness mirroring the years of injustice he'd endured. The air grew suffocating. The ex-residents conferred in low voices, unnerved to discover that the official version they'd believed for so long was built upon carefully crafted lies. Yet the tension was far from resolved. Then, something happened that took everyone's breath away. Jenna, who had been standing near the platform, let out a muffled gasp and clasped a hand to her belly. She felt a sudden, intense pang of pain, accompanied by a dizziness that forced her to cling to Ivan to keep from collapsing. A collective chill rippled through the crowd. The young woman's face was contorted in agony, on the verge of collapsing. "Jenna!" Ivan exclaimed, despair evident in his voice, rushing to keep her from falling. The gathering split in two. Some pressed forward to witness this dramatic turn, while others ran for medical help. In that moment of panic, everything else faded into the background. Alexander's confession, Leonard's fear, Eleanor's guilt. The priority now was to help a mother-to-be and save the life growing inside her. The collective shudder through the crowd made it clear that things could unravel at any second, and with them, the newly uncovered truths might be lost, leaving no guarantee they would ever be resolved. Jenna's cry resounded in the courtyard, silencing the swell of whispers that had risen after Alexander's confession. In mere seconds, chaos descended. The young woman, sweating profusely, clutched both hands to her belly and collapsed. Reacting on instinct, Ivan caught her before she could hit the ground. Elena, frantic, stumbled forward with her heart pounding, terrified at the thought of losing both her daughter and her future grandchild. The courtyard filled with frantic voices. Reporters fought for a closer vantage point. Ex-residents tried to help, but merely crowded the scene. Hector, the town doctor who happened to be there, pushed through with determined force, ordering the crowd to back away. He knelt at Jenna's side and took her pulse, calling urgently, "Someone call an ambulance now!" A couple of volunteers rushed to comply. Ivan clung to Jenna's hand, staring anxiously at her pale face. His breath quickened, and he could do little more than repeat her name, as though fearing his voice was all that kept her conscious. Elena felt her legs weaken beneath her. The scene seemed unreal. Only moments ago, the truth about Ivan's expulsion was coming to light, and now everything hinged on Jenna's life or death. Taking advantage of the commotion, Leonard seized his chance to flee. The chaos made for an easy escape route through the orphanage's side exit, and no one noticed his maneuver while all eyes were on Jenna. With his face drained of color, Leonard slipped away at a hurried pace, well aware that he would face justice eventually. But for the moment, his survival instincts told him to vanish. It wasn't long before an ambulance arrived, weaving through the onlookers, who parted with startled cries. Drawing on his years of medical experience, Hector took charge, coordinating with the paramedics. They lifted Jenna onto a stretcher, checking her vitals all the while. Ivan, hands trembling, pleaded to ride with her. "Please let me go with her," he begged, voice raw. The paramedic nodded, seeing his distress. Hector, fully aware of how serious Jenna's condition was, agreed. Then Ivan, turning his head, looked for Elena in desperation, spotting her frozen a few steps away. In his eyes was an unspoken plea for mercy or courage from the woman who had been so cold toward him until that moment. "Elena, get in," he urged, calling her by name instead of ma'am or Jenna's mother. "She needs you." Elena stood motionless for a few seconds, paralyzed by guilt, fear, and confusion. She snapped out of it only upon hearing Jenna's faint moan from inside the ambulance. A jolt of alarm struck her chest, compelling her forward. Without another thought, she climbed in, slamming the door behind her. The siren blared, its piercing wail breaking the silence that had fallen over the crowd. The ambulance sped away, leaving behind the stage, the chairs overturned by the panic, and a crowd still stunned by the sudden crisis. Every aspect of the event was now on hold. The accusations, the testimonies, Alexander's confession, and Leonard's escape were all secondary to Jenna's emergency. Inside the vehicle, Ivan held tightly to Jenna's hand while Hector conferred with the paramedics. Eleanor, in a state of shock, clung to a metal bar at the side, tears streaming as she stared at her daughter's ashen face. In that cramped, siren-filled space, they each grasped that Jenna's life and her baby's hung by a thread. Leaving the town behind, the ambulance raced toward the regional hospital. Their immediate goal was to save Jenna, and no one could say how events might unfold for those entangled in this drama once the old secrets again demanded explanations. The hospital corridor echoed with hurried footsteps and tense voices. Paramedics rushed Jenna straight to emergency surgery, while a medical team gathered around her in record time. Hector, his face drawn with worry, approached Ivan and Elena in the waiting room to explain the situation. Labor had started prematurely, and both Jenna and her baby were in serious danger. "There's a high risk of major complications," Hector said, his voice low but reassuring. "We'll do all we can. Have faith in us." Neither Ivan nor Elena could find any words. The tightness in their throats made it impossible to speak. A crushing silence fell over them as they watched the operating room doors close, leaving them teetering on the edge of dread. Ivan was shaking slightly, clutching Elena's arm. She, in turn, clung to him just as desperately, both aware that Jenna's life and her baby's hung on a precarious surgery. Time seemed to blur in that stark, white, coldly lit waiting area. Suddenly, Elena felt herself weakening. The guilt she'd long carried crashed down on her harder than ever, demanding the confession she'd postponed for too long. Her eyes reddened as she took in Ivan's anguish and grasped how unjust she'd been to him. Almost unconsciously, Elena sank to her knees. She saw herself as a worn-down woman who was finally ready to unburden the weight she'd been dragging for years. She gripped Ivan's hands and in a trembling voice began to speak. I was part of what accused you. I never meant it, but they forced me to sign papers saying you stole things, or I'd lose my job. My husband was very sick, and I felt I had no choice. I'm sorry, Ivan. I truly am." The words poured out in a rush, laden with remorse and regret. With each sentence, Elena was hit by memories of how the orphanage directors had pressured her, how she feared losing the meager pay that covered her dying husband's medication, and how she'd signed Ivan's expulsion order, knowing in her heart he wasn't guilty. Ivan listened in silence, tears hazing his vision. An overwhelming mix of anger and sorrow left him unable to breathe. Years of suffering, the isolation of feeling betrayed, and the label of thief that marked his life, all of it seemed to crystallize in this single moment. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he burst out, his voice strangled. "You let me believe I was a monster. You made me live with that guilt." Elena, pleading, dropped her gaze, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. "I couldn't face it, Ivan. I was afraid of losing everything. And afterward, I just never had the courage to come to you and admit it." He closed his eyes, rage coursing through him like a pulse. Yet amid that fury, he also felt a strange sense of relief. After all those years, he was finally hearing the truth from the very person who had signed his sentence. He let himself give in to his tears, somehow finding room for a measure of compassion in the process. Now it doesn't matter how we got here," he whispered, before wrapping his arms around her. "I forgive you, and I need to forgive myself too, for holding on to this hatred for so long." They held each other and wept, overwhelmed by guilt and the relentless passage of time. It was a freeing moment, a sort of balm on the old wound they both carried in their souls. The hospital corridor remained cold and silent, but for them, that embrace was a fire burning away their long-held bitterness. Amid their tears, hurried footsteps approached. Rick, Olivia, and Sophia arrived almost simultaneously, worry etched on their faces. No explanations were needed. They understood what was happening. Jenna was hovering between life and death, and Ivan and Elena had finally shattered the barrier that kept them apart. "How's Jenna?" Sophia asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "They just took her into surgery," Ivan murmured, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. Rick placed a supportive hand on Ivan's shoulder. Olivia, moved, hugged Elena gently, letting go of old grudges and resentment. No lofty words were spoken, but everyone knew they were sharing a moment where all differences vanished in the face of life's fragility. Sophia, sensing their shared need for hope, proposed a simple yet powerful gesture. They joined hands in a brief prayer or meditation, respecting each individual's beliefs, but united in the same longing that Jenna and her baby survive. It was an intimate instant, with their hearts beating in unison as each one raised a silent plea. Time seemed to stand still when, through the walls of the operating room, they could hear the unsteady beeping of the heart monitor. That irregular sound carried into the waiting area, its echo tightening the atmosphere. Ivan and Elena gripped each other's hands, putting an end not only to the cycle of hatred and guilt that had tormented them, but also marking a new beginning neither had foreseen at this forced reunion. In that moment, Jenna's and the baby's lives hung by a thread, and the truth had finally come to light. The question remained whether the hope they all shared would prove strong enough to bear them through the storm. Inside the operating room, it felt like a whirlwind of voices and lights. Jenna lay on the table, struggling to stay conscious while the medical team worked frantically to control the bleeding and help the baby be born. Hector, leading the group, issued concise commands to stabilize the mother's vitals and prep the necessary instruments. Jenna's breathing was labored, and her clenched hands gripped the bed rails, as if that grip contained all the strength she had left. Outside, in the corridor, Ivan and Elena faced the worst agony of their lives. With nerves on edge, they stared at the closed doors of the operating room, still holding each other's hands. In spite of the conflicts and painful silences that had long shaped their relationship, at that moment they were bound by a shared love for Jenna and the baby. From time to time, Ivan glanced at the grey walls, wrestling with the thoughts of a tragic outcome. Elena, still reeling from her confession, found comfort in Rick's firm embrace. In the adjacent waiting area, Sophia and Olivia were just as anxious. Both felt that their mission to restore the truth had been put on hold in favor of saving two innocent lives. The air was thick with tension, as though every drop of oxygen carried the plea for a miracle. Minutes passed, an eternity for those waiting, and the bustle inside the hospital grew louder as reporters and onlookers arrived, having witnessed Jenna's collapse at the orphanage. In his usual calm manner, Rick raised his voice to ask for the family's privacy. Fortunately, hospital security stood ready to keep cameras and microphones at bay. Inside the operating room, Jenna let out another desperate groan as a new wave of contractions racked her body. Hector continued encouraging her. "Hang on a bit longer. We're almost there. Breathe. Stay calm." The baby's heartbeat sounded on the monitor, weak but present. That fragile pulse became the spark of hope that pushed Jenna not to surrender, clinging to her will to live and to bring this child into the world despite the hardship. At last, after what felt like an endless wait, the operating room doors opened and Hector emerged, his scrubs stained with blood, but his eyes shining. Ivan sprang to his feet, heart pounding. "They're stable," the doctor announced before Ivan could speak. "Jenna and the baby both. She'll need the ICU and we'll watch the child closely, but they've made it through the worst." The reaction was immediate. Ivan sank onto the nearest chair and began to sob in relief, tears long held back by the fear of losing it all in mere seconds. Overcome by emotion, Elena clung to Rick, letting out a trembling, cathartic sigh. Sophia and Olivia, waiting in a corner of the hallway, silently joined in the moment, tears of joy streaming down their faces. While relief spread through the hospital, another big story began circulating in the local news. Leonard would be formally investigated. Enough evidence had been gathered to implicate him in the embezzlement and in orchestrating the frame-up that led to Ivan's unjust expulsion. A subpoena loomed on the horizon, and many anticipated seeing this man finally face the legal consequences of his actions. Though it felt like a partial victory, Jenna's condition was still critical, things began to calm down. Soon after, Ivan carefully made his way into the ICU, where Jenna lay amid tubes and monitors. Nearby, in a heated incubator, slept their tiny, fragile baby. Seeing him, Ivan felt a wave of tenderness, drowning out the weariness and sorrow in his heart. He approached Jenna, who slowly opened her eyes and kissed her forehead gently. He murmured a few words of welcome to their newborn child, thanking fate for letting them both survive such an ordeal. With a trembling touch, Jenna slid her hand over Ivan's, understanding that although a long recovery lay ahead, they had surmounted the worst. Reflected in the ICU window stood Elena, Rick, Sophia, and Olivia, gazing in deep emotion at the family. So bruised by the past, they all seemed to be renewed in that luminous instant. In the background, the steady beep of the monitor marked a firm, constant heartbeat, as if foreshadowing a promising future. The days following surgery were marked by both relief and caution in the hospital. Jenna, battling physical weakness, yet overjoyed to be alive, made gradual progress, inspiring hope in everyone. She still needed absolute rest, and the tiny baby, its little feet so small, remained under constant observation in the neonatal unit. Elena spent most of her time by her daughter's and grandson's side. Each morning when Jenna woke, she would find her mother arranging sheets, preparing a bottle, or whispering comforting words. Although the mother-daughter bond had entered a new stage, neither denied their tumultuous past. Still, every gesture from Eleanor, how she brushed Jenna's hair or adjusted her pillows, hinted that for the first time in many years, she was trying to be the mother she had once failed to be. Ivan, watching quietly from a corner, silently thanked life for granting them this seemingly impossible reconciliation. As the young family's life regained some stability, Open Hearts found itself in the midst of a much-needed transformation. Sophia, backed by a coalition of ex-residents led by Olivia, announced a series of structural reforms in management and the care given to the children. A meeting was held with volunteers, adoptive parents, and several donors, those who had chosen to continue their support despite the recent scandal. In a symbolic gesture, several ex-residents offered a public apology to Ivan, acknowledging his expulsion as a serious institutional error. Olivia's expression, moved yet resolute, captured their collective determination to ensure that such an injustice never happened again. Meanwhile, Alexander, the key figure in exposing the cover-up, felt a calm he hadn't known in years. He voluntarily approached the authorities, offering every detail about the embezzlement and the scheme that painted Ivan as the scapegoat. Though he faced legal repercussions for his own part in the affair, he accepted them with a certain inner peace. After all, his confession had freed him from the burden he'd carried for decades. The news that Leonard would face legal proceedings for his involvement cemented the sense that at long last, justice would be served. One weekend, once Jenna's doctor approved a brief outing, Eleanor made a decision that signaled a turning point in her life. Along with Rick, she returned to the orphanage, ready to face a community that had once respected her, but now viewed her with suspicion. In the main courtyard, the very site of the ex-residents' gathering, she delivered a heartfelt speech. Voice trembling, Elena apologized not only to Ivan, but to all those young people who once felt abandoned by the system. "I didn't protect you the way you deserved," she admitted, lowering her eyes. "I thought obeying certain orders would keep me out of trouble, and all I did was add to your pain." A wave of hushed comments mixed with timid applause. Not everyone forgave her immediately. Years of resentment are not undone by a few words. Nevertheless, for many, it was the first step toward reconciliation. It was the first time she had shown vulnerability to those who had once depended on her. Rick stood beside her, gently squeezing her shoulder, while Sophia and Olivia, in the background, nodded solemnly, grasping the gravity of the moment. By sundown, Elena and Ivan headed back to the hospital, where Jenna and the baby would remain under observation for a few more days. The tension that had weighed so heavily on everyone felt lighter now, as if the air itself had been purified. In the hospital room, Jenna cradled her baby, humming a lullaby she remembered from childhood. "How'd it go?" she asked Elena, noticing the tear stains on her mother's face. "It was tough, but needed," the older woman replied, reaching out awkwardly yet tenderly to touch her daughter's hair. Moments later, the door opened, and Olivia appeared with a group of ex-residents bearing flowers and baskets of small gifts for the newborn. They made their way toward Jenna and Ivan with shy smiles. For many, it was the first time seeing Ivan free of the accusations that had darkened his name for so many years. They formed a circle around the family, an air of solidarity and gratitude in the room, an atmosphere that crowned the end of a long, painful road. "We're so happy you're all right, Jenna," said Olivia on everyone's behalf, offering her a card wishing mother and child a hopeful future. "And you, Ivan, thank you for never giving up," added one ex-resident, voice choked with emotion. "Today, Open Hearts is being reborn, thanks in part to your courage." Ivan smiled in modest acknowledgement of the struggle he had carried for so long. He planted a soft kiss on his son's tiny head, making it clear that, despite all the old wounds, a new horizon now lay before them. In a far corner of the room, Elena watched with a heart full of gratitude. Even though she still carried guilt that would take time to heal, the path to redemption and family unity felt more real than she had ever imagined. So, amidst the guests' soft chatter and the baby's gentle breathing, hope permeated the air. The past could not be changed, but the steps taken so far proved that truth, justice, and love still had the power to break down walls and mend broken bonds. That night, the hospital lights shone with a different glow, as though heralding that peace had finally come after the storm. A few months had passed since that day in the hospital when Jenna had fought for her life and that of her baby. Now, time seemed to unfold with the serene calm of things that, after so much turmoil, had finally found their course. In Elena's house, the atmosphere was utterly transformed. The walls were freshly painted in light colors, the small garden bloomed with renewed vigor, and a warm light filled every corner. The oppressive silence and harshness that once ruled there had given way to a bright sense of renewal. Jenna, smiling and radiant with health, rocked her baby in an old chair that had been lovingly restored. The little one, wide-eyed with curiosity, waved his tiny hands, trying to grasp the specks of dust dancing in the sunlight. Jenna's face shone with peace and optimism, as though every sway of the rocking chair reaffirmed that the storm was well behind them. Ivan, meanwhile, was up on the roof fixing a few loose shingles, looking more at ease than ever, now that the guilt that hounded him most of his life had lifted, with the proof of his innocence. "Be careful up there," Elena called out, slightly anxious, peeking out the window. Ivan turned to smile at her, glad to see genuine concern in the eyes of the woman who once couldn't defend him. Elena returned a faint smile that acknowledged everything they had gone through, while also hinting at a new beginning. When Ivan climbed down, she offered him a glass of lemonade and a brief, emotion-laden word of thanks. Their simple exchange hinted at the harmony finally taking root in their relationship. Meanwhile, inside the house, Rick was going through some papers on the table, connected to his latest errands. Elena approached at an unhurried pace, holding a small wildflower she had picked from the garden. With a timid gesture, she handed it to him. Rick, pleasantly surprised, offered a gentle smile, realizing that this small token of affection was an unmistakable sign of something more intimate and genuine growing between them. Their shared glance revealed that, after supporting each other through the worst moments, their relationship was moving forward with the same trust you feel when facing a new dawn. At the Open Hearts orphanage, the reforms introduced by Sophia and a group of ex-residents led by Olivia were already bearing fruit. The walls had been repainted in cheerful colors, and the library was now stocked with additional learning materials. A scholarship and workshop program had just kicked off, giving children the chance to explore artistic, athletic, and academic skills. Ivan was fully involved in these efforts, committed to being the mentor he wished he could have had in his teenage years. His talks with the kids emphasized perseverance, honesty, and solidarity, demonstrating that rebellion can be channeled to defend the vulnerable rather than turn into destructive acts. That weekend, there was a small gathering in Elena's yard to celebrate the baby's baptism, or more generally, to welcome him into the world. The space was decorated with softly colored balloons and banners waving gently in the breeze. Relatives, friends, as well as ex-residents and orphanage volunteers, stopped by to take part in the celebration. True to his discreet nature, Rick handled the music and food, while Olivia entertained the guests with stories of their teenage years at open hearts. The most emotional moment arrived when Ivan, Jenna, and Elena, holding the baby in their arms, stood before the camera for a family photo. Joining them were Rick, Sophia, Olivia, Alexander, and Hector, the doctor who had saved Jenna's life at that critical moment. It was a picture charged with symbolism. There stood the mother reconciling with her past, the young man cleared of an injustice, the daughter restored to health, the protective doctor, the ex-residents who had raised their voices in pursuit of truth, and finally the allies who had dared to restore the orphanage's reputation. That snapshot left everyone with a deep sense of satisfaction. Corruption had been exposed, Leonard would face legal proceedings, Ivan was finally free of the thief label that had hounded him, and Jenna, radiant with her baby, laughed in the shared happiness of those who loved her. Meanwhile, Elena, at the foot of the house's steps, leaned on Rick with a discreet gesture of affection, surveying the scene with renewed hope in her heart. As evening fell, and the sky took on orange hues while the guests began to depart, an almost magical atmosphere reigned. It was as though the memory of old shadows had finally found its rightful place, dissolving in the light of truth, forgiveness, and solidarity. The conclusion, far from forgetting past mistakes, was about integrating each personal story into a new horizon, where life, bittersweet as it is, would continue unfolding. That day came to a close with a final image of a family and a community united in a collective embrace, recognizing that love, sincere remorse, and justice can overcome even the deepest darkness. An indelible message rose above all else. The truth, however harsh, sets us free, and love, however fragile, can rebuild the bonds we once believed were shattered beyond repair. This story reminds us that the past, however painful, always finds a way to surface. Secrets, guilt, and resentment can strain relationships and inflict deep wounds on those we hold most dear. Yet, when the truth finally emerges and is confronted with sincerity, it not only frees the innocent from their chains, it also offers a chance for reconciliation and a healthier future. Through forgiveness, both for others and for oneself, the characters manage to turn their scars into bridges that bring them closer again. In this way, love and solidarity ultimately prevail over bitterness and fear, closing old chapters and clearing the way for renewed hope. The greatest lesson here is that facing the truth and owning up to our responsibilities, however hard that may be, is the first step toward finding inner peace and reconciling with those around us. Lying or hiding our mistakes may look like an easy short-term escape, but it prolongs suffering and erects barriers to trust and closeness. By admitting our faults, seeking forgiveness with humility, and giving the support needed by those around us, we prove that it is always possible to repair the damage, that love, compassion, and justice will ultimately triumph over the darkness of the past. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope this story moved you as much as it moved us. Remember, love and truth always prevail. Take care, and we'll see you in the next tale.